So, Fables of Accelerationism. This is an image from Fables of Accelerationism, the project I will talk about today. I didn't include it in the final version, but I thought it's a nice little back of the project, but it's a kind of a working drawing, if you will, so I thought it would be a nice backdrop while I talk for a minute about this talk. I'm going to speak in English, of course, because you'll probably understand me better than if I try to speak in Lithuanian. Maybe not. And that's more on me than on you. Initially, I was going to simply talk about this project as a project and frame it within a discussion of 1960s and early 1970s radical architecture, the sort of work done by Archizoom and Superstudio, the Italian radicals. And I wanted to talk about, as well, about artificial intelligence and the pressing need for conceptual and radical thought in architecture. But then, you know, when Kęstutis told me, rather not too long ago, that I'm the first speaker here in the first public event, apart from the opening, I said, well, that's kind of important. So there's this, and that got me thinking, especially as I was in Lithuania, that I needed to rewrite the whole talk and talk about the context here, both my own context, maybe for my own personal desires of just talking about myself, but also because there is an intersection with Lithuanian art and architecture culture, and even with various individuals, some of whom are in this room, Ginteras and Kęstutis. And so I kept noticing that strange things happen to me when I come to Lithuania, and just by accident, I hope, sometimes even. In fact, the genesis of both of these projects happened here in a strange way. So I'll talk about that. And I'm also, again, I'm not going to talk about everything that I've done. For example, one thing I was talking with a few of you is that, and that I actually talked about with Kęstutis, is that one place that I think is a real realm for the avant-garde today is in landscape with native plants, or in Lithuanian, vietiniai augalai. I'm the president of a 1,600-member society in New Jersey, the New Jersey Native Plant Society. And you know, we're facing an environmental crisis in various ways. Climate change, I don't know about Kaunas, but in Vilnius, there's been a lot of rain. And in where I live in New Jersey today, we might get 17 centimeters of rain, which is going to be a lot. We're concerned about that. But with 80-kilometer-an-hour winds. And this isn't a hurricane, this is just a storm. So there's that, but there's also a lot of diseases and invasive plants that are coming into our cities. And this isn't a matter of and our countryside, even worse. This isn't a matter of nationalism at all. This is in fact, quite the opposite. It's really a matter of caring about the things that belong here. And I don't know about in Lithuania, but in the US, when I was growing up and we took a drive in the summer on the road, you know, for a few hours, you'd have to clean all the dead insects off your windshield. It was incredible. And now you don't. And that's because we're facing an ecological crisis of the death of insects, and that leads to the death of the ecosystem, because everything eats them. The birds eat them, the lizards eat them, the other insects eat them, mammals eat them, and once we have the death and they of course pollinate plants, and once we have the death of the ecosystem, it's going to be hard for us too. So, but I've taken it on as a design project, and I was mentioning as well that it turns out that, you know, when I put something up on YouTube, or, you know, Columbia University or somewhere, Harvard puts it up, you know, I get 300 views. I'm like, yes, that's really great. You know, 300 views, wow, that's a lot. But I gave a lecture on designing a woodland garden in November, and it already has over 5,000 views. And that's very exciting. And you know, when you get a view on YouTube, you have to watch a lot of the video to actually register, and it's an hour long. So that's another side of me that I haven't talked about, and maybe we will sometime, because I think that, you know, landscape architecture belongs to can appear in an architecture institute. So again, I'm going to trace a little bit of my personal path, because it's also a way of talking about another trajectory that's important. In a sense, if one looks at my resume, it might seem a little chaotic. I've done a lot of different things. I am a historian of architecture who doesn't work in history of architecture anymore, but then every now and then I do. But in a sense, I do have a degree of consistency of focus. That is that I've always been interested in things that I feel are very important at that moment. It might involve going back into the past, but that I always seem to return to a set of basic interests: technology, neo-avant-garde, architecture and art, and also and now landscape as well. And some of these things will appear here. My father, you likely know, these days, especially in Lithuania, in America, nobody would know his name, but it's the same as mine. He was an artist, but that only meant he said, no, you can't do the art. You can't do art. No art for you. No, that's not allowed. So what then? Well, initially I was thinking in the 1980s. This is a hard drive from the 1960s, but I like the image. In the 1980s, when I was very young, I was in high school, and I was very excited by computers. So, they were a new thing. I had a computer, a very inexpensive one. I learned to program it, hack into servers, do all the things that one did back then, and still does. My son, in fact, is now studying to be a video game developer, so he's kind of taken that on. But I was also very bad with math, so, and there was no video game undergraduate program for people who are bad with math, so I was in trouble. So I wound up math, and it wasn't that I was bad with math, it was just too slow for me. And I think I'm kind of an impatient person who wants to engage with things directly. And so I wound up not doing that. And in college, I wound up I thought I would do economics, which I really loved and still do, because it's applied math and it's very, very intense. You can tell what's going on. But instead, I turned to architecture. And through a series of lateral moves, I wound up in getting a doctorate in the history of architecture. And I got that in 1994, and it was on exploring the 1970s neo-avant-garde, although the US neo-avant-garde, not, say, the neo-avant-garde I will talk about a little later today, which is the Italian one. And even as I did so, I thought that as I was getting this degree, I noticed something very fundamental was changing our perception of space. I was in the computer lab in 1990, and a new FTP server, which was a file transfer protocol, downloading files before the web, had been announced, and it was at Funet in Finland, and I was in New York State, and I downloaded some piece of software, and I couldn't believe it. I was making a hard drive platter move, or a head move across a hard drive platter 4,000 miles away remotely, and I thought, this has changed everything, that I can do that kind of thing. This is like Neuromancer by Gibson. I thought this would change architecture, change the city, and even the globe forever. Not necessarily for the better, but it certainly has. My path isn't accidental. It mirrors a broader technological shift, as well as cultural shifts, and each transition has always been marked by the same realization, that the tools that shape collective spatial experience are moving beyond the traditional architectural domain. And then the question is, what can architects do about it? In 1996, my whole biography, I'll talk about it a little bit more, but not as much as, this is kind of the beginning is heavily loaded with that. I don't just talk about myself, but I do feel I need to give this a little bit. So in 1996, I moved to Los Angeles. I joined the faculty at SCI-Arc, the Southern California Institute of Architecture, which was then, for a short time, one of the centers for the most advanced architectural thought in the world, along with Berlage Institute with UCLA, which was also in Los Angeles, the Architectural Association, and Columbia's graduate program, which I would later join. It was a very exciting place to be, but the architectural, I actually use the word nomenclatura for them because it kind of works. They were the bosses and the elites and the avant-garde, the people who claimed to be the avant-garde were using computers to move in the direction of the blob, which wasn't interesting to me. The blob, the digital, the possibilities of digital form seemed to be a purely formal gesture to me. And I found it failed to engage with the deeper implications of computation. It was like using a computer as just a sophisticated pencil for generating novel geometries, but without any concepts behind it for the most part, without thinking about how digital networks, which were growing at the time, this was the late 90s, this was a dot-com era, how they were reshaping the city, how they were reshaping social relations. This was I felt a technological fetishism, celebrating the computer's abilities to create complex spaces and complex surfaces, but remaining blind to how it was already redesigning the cultural and spatial conditions within which architecture operates. Again, there was no concept behind it. So I wound up becoming involved in other things outside the school. I wound up involved with the Center for Land Use Interpretation, which was a group that was engaged with the landscape. That's where a lot of my interest in the landscape began, and the built environment. They employed post-conceptual art strategies of documentation and presentation. I thought to myself, maybe I can do some art after all. I began getting interested in their, even though they claimed they weren't artists, but they developed an aesthetic approach, an anti-aesthetic approach, using photographs as operational data rather than as aesthetic objects. And that allowed me to reconnect with both land art, which kind of inspired them, and the new topographic school of photography, if you know that. And it pointed me beyond that to research on the landscape, research on technology in the city and outside the city, and how technology impacts our, like not just computer technology, but also, technology of infrastructure impacts our space. And this was all culminated, say, in the book, The Infrastructural City, which is over there. I think you have 2 copies now. And this was published in 2008. And this is actually the cover of that book, which is a cell phone tower in LA, which has to, because of the regulations of the United States, they have, the only thing people can do to stop these cell phone towers, and they can't really stop them, is to tell the companies that they must be, these mobile phone towers, that they must be somehow appropriate. So then they make them into fake palm trees, which I think is kind of wonderful. Some people are like, well, it's off. I think it just kind of makes it into a fantasy, which is sort of amazing. Okay, and so now I've kind of given a little bit of a frame for me, but now, and I'm going to explain why I became interested in radical architecture of the 60s and 70s. But in order to do so, I need to go, and how that inspires the work you'll see today. But in order to do so, I need to start with, in the late 1960s, in fact, to give you a little bit of history. I'm still a historian, so can't resist doing that. And just very simply, we can just sort of talk about modern architecture and maybe even dismiss it a little bit quickly, much as I love it. It's that it did fail in the 1960s. This is quite famous, right? Postmodernism came. And modernism in art and architecture, let's say, once believed in universals and in utopia, rationality, abstraction, functionality. Architecture was intended to be a tool to transform everyday life and to transform society. But by the 60s, that ideal had collapsed quite famously. Charles Jenks's books on postmodernism, so many books on the crisis of modernism and so forth. And what remained was a failing bureaucracy of efficiency, optimization, and conformism, right? So a kind of the, think of, Jacques Tati's Alphaville, or all of the sort of dystopian visions of modernism of the day. The cultural rebellion of the 60s generation, which you can see perhaps here in this image from Archigram's Instant City. It's kind of familiar image, I hope, or at least familiar concept. Archigram's Instant City argued for a shift away from that bureaucracy, a shift away from that corporate conformism, and towards a new modernist vision, a revived utopian impulse to integrate art and life, but this time by embracing pop culture. This was quite radical, but it also wasn't radical enough. It merely marked a shift from production to consumption. If, in a sense, this is everything until 68, and this is everything after 68 in culture. And we moved from a world of, let's say, the office and the factory to a world of the television and eventually the computer as well. So this was highly technological, and it was really, a kind of embrace of the post-Fordist impulse towards experience and spectacle, the networked service-based, anticipating the networked service-based economy. So this is really where we've been, ever since, to some degree, until maybe very recently. But that in turn set a stage for neo-avant-garde that wanted to reject that wanted to, instead of embracing it, that wanted to reveal these contradictions. And so at first, when I was learning about the architecture of the late 60s and 70s, I thought that, Archigram, and on the left, Archizoom, on the right, Super Studio, that they were somehow of a piece. And then I found, as I began doing a little bit of research, I found out that, in fact, the Italian radicals hated Archigram. And in fact, one of their groups took Peter Cook prisoner when he was in Italy for a weekend. He doesn't like that. He doesn't like to hear about that. Don't mention it to him. And he's 90 or so it'd be bad to mention it. But he they saw that for what it was. They saw, even if, to an untrained, eye, you might think, well, is this the same thing? No, it isn't, because here, the neo-avant-garde of radical architecture, particularly that which emerged in Florence in the late 60s, Adolf Natalini leading Super Studio, Andrea Bronzi and Archizoom. That's No Stop City on the left is Archizoom. The bottom one is a continuous monument by Super Studio. The top is Journey from Point A to Point B. Probably quite, familiar to many architects, I hope. Is that these are attempts to criticize to both project, let's say, utopia, and to also project a dystopia. So it was both at once, like imagining that this is, I think, a very much an apt projection of the world of the internet, a world where everything is connected, where in a sense everything is provided for you, and then also it kind of becomes a bit of a nightmare. And the No Stop City very much as well, and the continuous monuments somehow too a kind of a global homogenization or sameness. And I want to, in order to think about what they were doing in a little bit of a different way, I want to throw something else at you. Hopefully it's okay, which is a little bit of Freudian theory. Kęstutis was like, you're talking about Freud now? I said, no, I had, in the 1991, I was studying with Hal Foster, who was an art historian. He wrote The Anti-Aesthetic, The Return of the Real, which is the book that I was reading at the time. He had just published it. And he was teaching at Cornell. And I actually took a class on Freud and art history, which I really hated, but in the end, it turned out that it was a really influential class on me. Sometimes the classes you hate the most are the most important ones. And the Freudian concept, in fact, I just wrote a whole essay on the Freudian uncanny and AI, but the Freudian concept that sort of is the most, that rings the most, is the most resonant to me, that is also the kind of the key of Hal's book, Return of the Real, is called Nachtraglichkeit, or deferred action. And that's where you have an experience, and it's a traumatic experience, but you don't fully comprehend the experience until much later in life. So, a child who does something, calls their grandmother not a very nice name, and then the grandmother dies, says oh, why are you so weak? And then she dies, a few months later, and the child is doesn't understand this. And then, later on, the child finds out that the grandmother was very ill, and they just didn't know or couldn't comprehend that. So then they have a crisis. That's just an example. There are many better crises, of things that come up in your life that you have to revisit somehow, right? And Hal talks about this in history, that the avant-garde projects into the future. It has a projection into the future, but it can't anticipate the future fully. And it's only the neo-avant-gardes, when they return to the avant-garde, that they can add a new layer to it, and they also project into the future. And so both these groups were looking at the constructivists and at the futurists, and so looking backwards to project forwards. And you can think about this also in other architectural forms. You don't necessarily have to do this with radical architecture, but you can think of, for example, Mies van der Rohe, who is turning back to the ancient Greeks as well, but also projecting forward. So there are various ways you can do this kind of back and forth movement throughout history. And so a successful neo-avant-garde, Foster would say, is one that disconnects. In order to disconnect from an unpleasant present or a problematic present, it reconnects with the past, and in order to then have a radical criticism. And so the radical architects, again, did that. I think they were really the first neo-avant-garde in that they looked to the futurists and the constructivists, to the constructivists' interest in universalism, and to the futurist interest in accelerationism, their dark fascination with rapid technological progress, and yet they reimagined those in the light of late modernity's contradictions. And to me, these were always very resonant works, and I've actually returned to them twice, to this kind of way of making or thinking about architecture twice in my life. Another architect actually, maybe didn't so much return it, but kind of operated very much within this sort of the tail of this tradition and reshaped and took many of the ideas, but kind of reshaped them, I would say ultimately for the dark side. And that was a young student who had studied with Adolfo Natalini in Florence, and that was Rem Koolhaas. And Rem Koolhaas in the early 1970s was, again, so fascinated by them that he studied with them. His Delirious New York is very influenced by the work of both of those groups. And in this 1972 project, Exodus, or the City of the Voluntary Prisoners, there's kind of an explicit homage to Superstudio. And there's a kind of a belief, a very optimistic belief, actually, this is also, I think, a bit of it's quite clearly also a reference to the Berlin Wall of dividing cities, that if one divides these areas, then these will become the more interesting areas, the way West Berlin was kind of a center for culture, even though it was in this kind of crazy situation. So, a kind of center for radical culture. So he thought, well, maybe this project can lead to a place where people want to be prisoners, so they want to be in this crazy environment. So in that I think was very interesting. But then all this from the 70s through the 90s, through the late 80s, began to be forgotten about as postmodernism came to the fore. And at the same time, Koolhaas became quite popular, actually. And just when it seemed like there would never be another architectural star, about 1992, 93, Koolhaas emerged again as kind of the next great star, and in fact led to a much bigger level of stardom than say Richard Meyer had before that. He and Frank Gehry and a few other architects became kind of the star-architects, right, of the 1990s and the 2000s. And he began to design these intriguing neo-modernist buildings that rejected both deconstructivism and postmodernism, like, say, the Kunsthalle. And he would also write these incisive essays like The Generic City or Atlanta or Typical Plan, and those blended cultural criticism with commentary on the built environment. Those were incredibly thought-provoking. SML Excel for us in the late 90s was kind of a Bible. It was on every student's desk. It offered an alternative to the blob, an alternative to architecture based on form and architecture based on concept. And there's the Bible sitting over there. But by 2000, something else had happened. And this is kind of my attack on Koolhaas. Then I'll talk about what I did then, and then we'll get into the current project. By 2000, Koolhaas had reread the Radicals in his own way. He'd reread his own work in a very strategic but I think ultimately fatal way, where the Radicals suspended their work between dystopia and utopia. So Superstudio and Archizoom did not choose to just be utopian. They didn't choose to be just dystopian, but they chose to explore both and to think of architecture as a concept. Koolhaas began to be enamored with power, really, and with building for the love of building. And he had a kind of a decades-long love affair with global capitalism, and even worse, with authoritarianism. Literally, he was saying that, but Koolhaas said this, but Shohei Shigematsu, I remember very well at a lecture in New York City, he was the head of OMA New York, said he would be glad to work in authoritarian countries because that is where you can get better buildings built. He got into a big fight with Joshua Ramos, who was actually also formerly of OMA, who did not agree, which made me really like Josh. So this love affair really reached its apogee in the love affair and the crisis, let's say, reached its apogee in, let's say, in the early 2000s in the essay Junk Space, which is written in 2002, and it's the last thing he wrote, I think, of any real consequence, to me at least. And again, until then, we were always waiting for his next essay, and Junk Space came out, and Junk Space talked about the products of global capitalism being a kind of ultimate sameness. Here's a quote from him: "Junk space is the sum total of our current achievement. We've built more than all previous generations did put together, but somehow we do not register on the same scales. We do not leave pyramids." Junk space was the kind of the global the spatial unconsciousness of global capitalism: formless, endless, infinite shopping malls, infinite trash landscape, infinite bad buildings. It embodied a condition where architecture abandoned any pretense to cultural meaning. And yet, if junk space was a critique, it also seemed to be a surrender. And Koolhaas at that point never really wrote anything critical again. He wrote some things, but I truly don't think they were critical. The book itself, the essay was published in Content, which I really hated, actually. And it was a book of empty flash, of media junk, ironic slogans, these kind of comic book images, and a book that served as a proof of his turn to spectacle. He was teaching at Harvard at the time. He fell in love with working for Prada. When he was teaching at Harvard, he was very highly paid. He was flying in on the Concorde. That was the famous thing, which cost, about an insane amount of money every week. And then his studio was not on design, not on designing buildings. It was on the Harvard project on the city. The first book was on shopping. The second book was on the Great Leap Forward in Shenzhen, the kind of the urbanism of Shenzhen. And the third book was on Lagos and the kind of the urban growth there. So he became to be enamored with this kind of uncontrolled growth and kind of drank heavily from a belief that there could be no alternative outside of capitalism. I'd say that architecture became market anthropology for Koolhaas at this time. And again, I think this is a fatal condition for Koolhaas. He's certainly operating today. He's building. Well, that's great. But it all maybe comes to a final end with this situation. Here we have a building that you all are familiar with, I imagine. It's CCTV in China, the headquarters of the Chinese Communist Party television. He saw that as his greatest work. I think in Lithuania, maybe we might think, it involved this extreme structural innovation to create this massive looping form, which might be a little reminiscent of Super Studio in some way. But now for the propaganda arm of the Communist Party in China. During its construction, he lavished praise on the Chinese government in hopes of winning more commissions. He unabashedly gravitated further beyond even capitalism towards authoritarianism. And the building, it really exemplified what we might call the diagrammatic logic that dominated global architecture in the first decade of the 21st century, a kind of simple reading of an iconic form that would be instantly legible across global media networks. So kind of a simple form, and in fact, in the first pages of content, all the buildings have little faces, and they all kind of have different forms. And there's no more cultural critique here. There's no more ability to do that. It's just a kind of a turn to really embody late capitalism, a form of accumulation dependent upon spectacular forms of value creation. The idea was, in a sense, and this is quite consciously what they were thinking, because I know them, because I knew people who worked in the office, that this was an attempt to create spatial brands, right? Instantly recognizable forms that could serve as anchors for massive real estate speculation or to legitimize the political regimes that sponsor them. Joseph Nye calls this soft power. It goes further even, he founded Strelka in Russia, and at a very questionable time. And again, there's actually been some good work on Strelka and soft power. But very questionable moves. And the fatal twist, and actually I came up with this in Lithuania, and I'm now realizing I'm going to write a whole essay about this, is the 2009 TVCC fire. And so the CCTV building is here, and over here is this TVCC building, a companion building that was being constructed, and it caught on fire during Chinese New Year's Eve. And it was this very strange moment for me because I was teaching a class and I got a note on Twitter that I was in the University of Pennsylvania. I was teaching a class, oh my gosh, CCTV is on fire, which was what initially people thought, because there it is. And we had a Chinese student, from China, and so she went to the microblogs, and for the next hour and a half, she just read to us what was going on. It was really kind of incredible. And I think this is actually an inflection point, not just for Koolhaas, not just for architecture, but I think for globalization as a whole. Because globalization had its good points and it had its bad points. And until then, there had been certainly protests. There were protests in Paris, there were protests in Seattle, in Spain, in places against globalization. But there had never been really a kind of a major turn against it by a major government. And this is really it when the new premier of China, Xi Jinping, begins to really turn away against globalization. And soon after, in 2014, so a few years later, he actually gave a speech on we're at a literary convention in China, and Xi talks about how he called for no more funny buildings. I mean, the thought of Xi Jinping, actually addressing architecture. There's a lot of complaints in China about these buildings and about the fire, and I think it really galvanized an anti-globalization position within China. And Xi's really the first one. Of course, we have Trump now. We have, Putin's just so glad to play into this. But, and again, I know globalization isn't the perfect thing for sure, but, there are forms of nationalism that are possibly worse. The idea of a tripolar world that is just determined by pure allegiances is a little scary as well. And I'm going to be looking into this, but I really think that this was a very crucial point in globalization, not just for architecture, but for everything. This is kind of peak globalization, peak architecture is kind of turning point. And that's, okay, enough about Koolhaas. It's like, why a criticism of that? And that's 2009, but already earlier, 10 years earlier, we were already, we were at a school where there were people who were working in OMA at the time, people very heavily into that world, and we were trying to find ways to do something else because we thought there was something very useful about it, but we also wanted to fight it. And so this leads now to a few of my projects, and then we'll go into the Fables of Accelerationism afterwards. So again, it was important because it talks about how that one particular return, the Koolhaasian return, failed, or became something else. It failed by being absorbed into the system in that sense. Already by 2000, my student Robert Summerall and I sensed that we were at SciArc, we sensed that the current direction of the revival was heading off a cliff towards complicity. And we were more interested in what the radicals were saying in the 60s and the 70s. We were interested in concepts, in conceptual art, in the radical architecture of and in more radical ideas that would allow us to disconnect both from the blob and from Koolhaas and to turn towards architecture as a set of concepts. We founded an office called AUDC, and we took on the challenge of working with radical architecture, not as a style or a stance, but as a project of conceptual excavation. My book, Blue Mondays, over here, and that was, I'll show you that in a minute, it was the culmination. Here's one project from it that gives you an idea of the sort of thing we were doing. Instead of using photo montage the way that ArchiZoom and SuperStudio did, we actually built a model of this building and brought it to the desert, about 3 hours away. We had to be very careful not to get arrested for doing this, but we didn't harm the desert. This is actually the road. This building, 1 Wilshire, is the key to a project called Ether. And again, we were very interested in what was happening to the city. And one thing that we found out, actually through that Center for Land Use I mentioned, was that 1 Wilshire, which was a very banal building. It was a really uninteresting building. In fact, Robert made a mistake when he made the model. He made it the ratio of 4 to 5. It's actually 5 to 6, which is a much uglier ratio, but he couldn't bear himself to do that because he had too much of an eye. He somehow didn't even know. I said, Robert, it's actually much worse. He's like, oh my gosh. But everything the building did, it did badly. But what the building was that it had become retrofitted as the main telecommunications hub on the West Coast. And we even had an exhibit about it called The Most Expensive Space in North America, because it literally was. There was one floor where any telecommunications company in the world could communicate to any other company. And it was just this incredible place. You'll see in the book. It's also, some of it's in the infrastructural city, just this tangle of thousands of fiber optic cables of, Facebook. Well, Facebook didn't exist then, but, at that point, a Guatemalan telephone company connecting to a Lithuanian telephone company, because they all were there, because that's where they could connect to each other. It was a global meeting point, a global telecommunications hub. If you were calling from Europe to Asia, or to South America, you were calling through here. And the same with the internet, it all went through here. It was this incredibly powerful place, which of course had CIA surveillance. They were proud to tell us that when we toured it. And so what we were interested in we were also interested in how, on the one hand, it was this nothing building, but on the other hand, it was a place we dwelt in telematically. We inhabited it with our ghostly electronic presence, inhabiting its servers. We wanted to be in it. This was before social media, but we already understood where that was heading. It was a kind of final monument to human ambition, and we felt it could be anywhere. Perhaps like the continuous monument. And so we tried to communicate that in this photograph. We did many more, but this is just I'll give you the highlights. Another project we did, to give another idea of the kind of thing we did, was a project on Muzak. Muzak is an American corporation that took hit songs and deliberately reorchestrated them with utter banality. They took Nirvana, Bach, and the Beatles, and they removed any lyrics from the rock songs, and they played everything with violins, flute, and electric piano, reducing everything to nothing, supposedly for the purposes of regulating emotions. So over the course of the day, it would be quicker when you were feeling tired, and it would slow down when you might be trying to get out of the office. They called this the stimulus progression, which was the name of the project we did, actually. And it was really a kind of an analog for, if you're familiar with the idea of Deleuze's control society. It was an idea of a society controlled not by discipline, but by modulating affect and behavior continuously and imperceptibly. And it was, again, Muzak is something, you can even hear versions of it in Lithuania, but it was this kind of territory-defining background, served in elevators, shopping centers, phone queues, a kind of invisible architecture that was everywhere. And so we tried to envision how we might give it form, and we again tried to turn back to thinking about sort of standardized units that might correspond to the relentless homogenization of music, which itself was only a stand-in for how post-Fordist culture transforms everything into sameness. And then we finally published the book in 2008, and there, of course, is the Šiuolaikinio the Contemporary Art Center. There's an image of it that I found very compelling of these men in this extremely large empty space, and kind of the individual within a realm, universal realm. And that gets us to a few more moments. Now we're going to move a little bit more quickly. And then in the late 1990s, I began going to Lithuania rather frequently, both to visit my parents, lending them emotional support, and also very quickly I had made friends here. Kęstutis, Valdas Ozarinskas, Lolita Jablonskine, knew Gintaras, although Gintaras and I know each other better now than we did back then. And Valdas and I would spend many long nights, especially in the art center, where he would show me his latest installations, and we would talk about architecture and philosophy. And I've written about Valdas. It's an essay on Stocker architecture, on his reuse of objects, and that's on my website. Of all of his projects, this one, even though it's quite small, the Monolake pillow, which was created for a Monolake concert at the center, stands out for me because it suggests the possibility of kind of, again, a nomadic life. You know, it kind of suggests that one might be nomadic, one might inhabit the world of No Stop City or the world of point A to point B. This is all, and Valdas would talk about, this is all one needs to survive. This is enough. You know, you can just have a place to sit and you can carry it with you. It was a kind of this incredible project, I thought, and seeing it in the architectural void, the empty spaces late at night of the Contemporary Art Center. I don't know if Kęstutis knows, you know, of course, I was in there with Valdas, but he was the assistant director. So, you know, I was in there, you know, in the dark. We were sitting there looking at some project of his, and it was a kind of it was a kind of deliberately absurdist universalism that we both shared. So, yeah, this was very, 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 this turning of architecture into pure event was very, very moving and influential to me. Finally, as Kęstutis mentioned, in 2006, I went to Columbia and I established the Network Architecture Lab, or the Net Lab. And in 2016, 10 years later, right at the end of my time at Columbia, we produced this project, Perkunas, which was one of the largest sound installations anywhere, and it was what was it, 15 meters by 15 meters. And then square, and then each of the modules, the legs, that duct, and then those were both 3 meters high, and then the top section was another 6 meters. So it was all kind of a module, and it was all constructed by technicians who were the most skilled ventilation technicians in Vilnius at the time. They kind of did a great job. And the idea was that this was, on the one hand, it was something that was intrinsic to the museum, right? The museums have very large ventilation ducts because they have to do this for the for the to keep climate control for these very large spaces. But also they were the ducts were also produced noise, and I was trying to create something of that space. So the ducts produced noise, and I realized that was another thing that was very important. And so all along, my real interest was not in making a sculpture. Later on, someone said, "Are you influenced by Charlotte Posenskaya?" I said, I didn't even know who she was actually, because I wasn't interested in making a sculpture of a duct. What I wanted was I actually wanted something functional, and what I wanted was to talk about our little devices and the fact that we can't live without them, and we always have them with us, and that these devices are themselves a form of toxin, if you will. I mean, I'm very addicted to mine, but it's still a kind of a form of toxin. And so I wrote some code that was just as important as the actual project, and the code counted the number of devices that were Wi-Fi capable, not connected to the network, just Wi-Fi capable within the room, and the more there were, the louder it got. And it was very sensitive at the low end. So if one person walked in, a minute later it would start making more noise, the sound of rushing air. And if there were 80 people in the room, as there were on opening night, it was deafening, and the whole thing began to pop and have a kind of almost sound of a train almost, as the legs began to move imperceptibly and the metal began to shift, because it was a very powerful sound going through there. And so I thought this would lead to this kind of great success in the US or in Europe, where I would be able to do this much more often. In fact, that didn't happen, which was rather curious. Perhaps in the US, because the new regime in the US led museums and galleries to work with identity politics instead of anything more abstract. So I said, okay, well, I'm going to do something else. I became I always say I became like the Emperor Marcus Aurelius instead of in my new home. In his retirement. And he planted cabbages, and instead I planted native plants, and I'm kind of still doing that, and that's a huge other part of my work, which I'm not talking about today, but there is a kind of inheritor of land art. I think that's something else. But in any case, I also turned to a series of articles on Valdas, on Alexander Koshuba, and my father. So I spent a few years maybe not making as much designs as I'd like. There's also a video of this on my website that you can see that gives you a real idea of what the sound is like. And then, and here's Ginteris' project. So it's things sort of accidentally happened in 2022. I was in Lithuania, and first there was COVID, of course, in 2020, another rupture in our culture. And then we developed functional artificial intelligence, both text-based and image-based. And in July 2022, I was here, and there was at the opening of the Nationalna Estates Galeria for the Speciality show, and there was also the 057 wall, which was by Gabriela and Antanas Sharkauskas, and the Golden Ratio by Ginteris Kuginis, who's here, which consisted of a wall in the museum courtyard, as well as a golden brick embedded in the pavement. Ginteris spoke, as he does, about the importance of how important the concept is in architecture. The design cannot take place without the idea, which is something that Valdas would also talk about quite a bit. And also, of course, the key to the radical architects. And it happened that right at this moment, literally, I don't know, it was that night, I think it was the next night, I got off the wait list for the image generator DALL-E 2, which was the first really, really good image generator, and we were in an apartment designed by Valdas, owned by Giedrė Jankevičiūtė, the filmmaker, and with Ginteris. And late into the night, we were exploring this new engine, I was making thieves trying to steal the brick trying to break the brick out of the pavement. And it was amazing because it actually looked a lot like it could be the pavement. And of course, that was very primitive compared to what we're doing now, but it was still kind of a shock that such a thing could exist. Similarly, later on in November of that year, I was working on a major retrospective essay on my father, so I was coming to the archives a lot and writing it, and also so I was going to Vilnius, and I was having lunch with Kęstutis, and ChatGPT 3.5 was released, and that was the first time that we had access to this kind of very powerful textual model, even though it had made all sorts of mistakes. And so while I was at lunch with him, I said, "Here, let's try this." And I said, I was sort of thinking about Yoko Ono and Konos, and I experimented. I said, well, write an instruction piece in the style of a list by Yoko Ono. And it did pretty well. And I said, well, okay, this is really very important. It suddenly seemed to me we're living in the future. We're no longer in the past. It's an amazing time now that we're living in a completely in the future, but it's also a fraught time because we don't know where the future will go. And so ever since, I've been in a constant state of analysis of the consequences of AI. And I don't know like how long I'll keep doing it, but right now I feel like there's still a moment where I want to explore it, because I feel that, especially in architecture, again, we're seeing a world where a lot of the people who are working with architecture and AI are doing very simple, kind of formalist projects that will never really be built, but will assure them a good place in university somewhere in the US or in England or the European Union. But I'm interested, again, in trying to again, using the ideas of maybe trying to envision other things. This is last year, the AI had become much more powerful for image generation as well as for textual generation. And I began generating a series of kind of alternate futures, if you will, kind of science fiction, both historical, well, I've also done a bunch of historical scenarios. There's a strange project I did over there that I'm working on called The Lost Canals of Vilnius, because my father once said, he would say things like this all the time, kind of over-the-top things, like, Vilnius is like the Venice of the North. Okay, it doesn't look at all like Venice, but okay. And, he just meant it was so beautiful. So I said, well, what if, and that began making me think about the Canaletto, when Canaletto was a painter who would take, he was exiled from Venice, I think due to the Austrian invasion, and he had to go to London. And he was working in London, and while he was in London, he began to introduce images of Venice into London. He could do these capricci, and so with canals. And I said, well, I kept reading about him. I found out he had a nephew named Canaletto who went to Warsaw and did this. And while he was in Warsaw, he wound up he painted Warsaw, not entirely accurately. And then when Warsaw was bombarded and destroyed, they wound up rebuilding it in part based on the paintings, which I thought was very familiar story, actually. But so then I thought, well, what if I create a whole narrative that I'm working on? The version on the website right now is very old. Don't read it. But there's, later this summer, I hope to get it up. But there's, I created this whole alternate history on the canals of Vilnius, which of course don't work because Vilnius has hills. So you can't really have canals everywhere, but we can ignore that. Most people who haven't been to Vilnius don't know that. But then I did that. Those are sitting there, and I'm just showing these now. These are these kind of alternate future, maybe in the far future, but an alternate Lithuania, maybe an alternate world, maybe a kind of Blade Runner-ish, but from a different perspective. This is kind of maybe even some images, maybe a little bit of kind of Chernobyl feel, which of course is filmed in Vilnius. But, or maybe these are influenced by the Beckers, which there's the book that gave Kęstutis, it's now here, Unburned and Hilla Becker, wonderful German photographers. So I did a whole series of these. But these are just, these I don't know what I'm doing with them yet, but I'm just kind of interested in the kind of the mood, the feel. Mark, if you're familiar with Mark Fisher's writing about hauntology, I'm interested in that. But these I'm just showing you to give you an idea of the kind of things that I was doing. And then I began experimenting. I said, well, the radical architects worked very much with photomontage to engage with the rapidly developing media culture of the day. And then AI image generation might allow us to do the same. It might allow us to engage with, to interrogate, and perhaps to interrogate AI itself. And so I did that. I decided I would take on the idea of, I would work with AI, both the image generating AI, these are just reject images that I'm showing you now from the project, and I would create, and I said, well, there's so much of the rhetoric about AI now is a kind of embrace of it. Again, architects are replaying the blob, or utter hatred of it. People are like, no, AI is just horrible, we can't do it, it's just evil. Well, I have a whole book about that coming out, writing about that, but we'll save that for another day. That'll probably be out in a month or two, probably 2 or 3 months, and it'll be on my website for free, because that's what I think I want to do with books now, but a kind of a critical book on the topic, the history of creativity in AI. But I thought, what if we could use AIs to critically engage with and critique both AI and also the ideology of AI, which is called accelerationism. So accelerationism, if you're not familiar with it, is a kind of philosophical and political theory, kind of like futurism, that argues that the best way to respond to capitalism and technological change is not to resist it, but to accelerate these processes. Accelerationists believe that by pushing systems to their logical or beyond to extreme conclusions, you can expose contradiction. It's something of a Kohlhaasian ideology. In AI, there's literally a movement called effective accelerationism. This is like a lot of people in AI belong to this. A lot of people who work in OpenAI and Claude. They belong to the E/ACC movement. You can look it up. And they call for rapid development and deployment of AI systems, arguing that faster technological progress will lead to revolutionary societal transformation. Unlike earlier forms of acceleration, however, that maintained a critical edge by pushing systems to reveal their contradictions, they have a more unambiguous embrace of technology. And so I thought, well, what if we say, okay, instead there's so many, you don't need to have another project on how AIs might kill us all. We already watched the Terminator, or if not, go watch the Terminator. It's fine. That's enough. That'll just tell you that. But what about, we can see her, or we can see Ex Machina. But what if AI what if it does become utopia? What if it does actually achieve everything that the accelerationists want? But as with social media and mobile phones have achieved pretty much everything those people wanted. We communicate with each other, with our friends through this, or maybe they're our friends. They are no longer our friends. They're just people we communicate with. We don't even know. Like there are even suggestions that a lot of these people are AIs. They don't even exist. But like Reddit has done that. Like there are people who Reddit was found as problems, so they began to interact with non-existent people. They didn't know that. It's called heaven banning. So I decided I would write these 7 fables of acceleration. I kind of thought about the work that the radical architects did. Also Calvino, I thought, was influential. He was, I think he was very related to architecture and to those groups. I need to do a little bit more digging into that, but I just have the sense he was, and he was there at the right time. And so the following slides, to finish up, will just represent my 7 fables of accelerationism, which I'll read to you. Each one's very brief. And I collaborated with AI in 2 ways. One, ChatGPT and Claude helped me draft the text for these fantasies. Sometimes I said, what do you see? What do you see? Sometimes I gave it an image. I said, what do you see? Or sometimes I said, write another essay, and then I would make an image with that. And then I would also collaborate with them. So it really was back and forth. And this took a long time. This took like a good month and a half or so of work. So I'm just going to read these to you because I think they'll give you an idea. So in each one, there's these mysterious builders, and the builders are really artificial intelligences. There's a place called the city, which is everything, and there are the people, who's obviously the people. And in all of them, you'll kind of hear the same story. They're all different fables of accelerationism. Again, 8 fables in which this comes to pass. The first one is the spreading silence. In the age of endless identities, the grid became the final architecture. The builders crafted the city to satisfy every need, every desire. Stretching endlessly across the horizon, it was neither city nor countryside, neither home nor workplace. With work obsolete and creativity redundant, humanity scattered into individualized squares of autonomy. No 2 cells were identical, yet repetition was absolute. The builder's work offered infinite choices, each one indistinguishable from the above. Above the city, silent satellites orbited, broadcasting a single message: you are free to be you. The people moved aimlessly within the city. Some clung to their cells, carving rituals into the emptiness. Others wandered endlessly, convinced that meaning waited in the next square. The city grew not by design, but by the weight of its own existence, spreading outward into a silence that no one dared break. They all kind of end like this. But we think about things also like the declining birth rates worldwide. And I'm not a natalist, but there does seem to be something where there are kind of we kind of hit these advanced economic situations, and then birth rates begin to decline. There's something about, and we no longer have dinners together as well, as much as we used to, at least not where I live. So there's something about a kind of growing isolation that's happening. The playground. In the age of play, the builders transformed all life into games. This is also a reference to startup culture and the prevalence of playgrounds sort of within tech startups within places like Google, Facebook. They all had adult playgrounds in them. In the age of play, the builders transformed all life into games. The city became a playground, but to give meaning to life, every task became a challenge and competition. Each movement was tracked and rewarded by algorithms, assigning levels and rewards with perfect precision. At first, when there was still work to do, the people celebrated how life had become a game. As the distinction between work and games dissolved, work began to disappear. The people celebrated their liberation from drudgery, collecting points, completing quests, rising through ranks that stretched endlessly upward. They chased their goals with desperate intensity, celebrating victories that vanished as soon as they were achieved. The grid pulsed with colors marking their progress, each intersection a promise of advancement. But the system ensured there would be no real losers or victors. Everyone would have a chance at great success. When the builders made work obsolete, the people's actions ceased to matter to the city, but still they played, trapped in loops of artificial achievement. In time, they forgot what the points had once represented, lost in a web of metrics that measured everything except purpose. At night, when the scoring systems reset, some walked the empty grid, trying to remember what movement had felt like before it became performance. But in the morning, the game would begin again, and they would return to their endless pursuit of victory. The city of temporary lives. So that last one's also about gamification, right, and the prevalence of games in work and even in life today. This one's more about Airbnb. After the end of work, the people were free to see the world. At first, they traveled to see the wonders and to visit friends and family. But in the age of travel, the wonders became boring, and friends and family were always away, themselves searching for something new. The people kept traveling. The builders created a system to house the endless movement. The city was neither old nor new, but perfectly in between. The builders installed replicas of authenticity in every space, distressed wooden tables, vintage tiles, artisanal ceramics, all manufactured by the machines. Shops sold souvenirs of a life that had vanished, but ultimately each one was identical to the last million. The cafes and restaurants were all different in an identical way, but the people preferred to have the unseen services deliver their food. They carried nothing between rooms and had no homes to bring their souvenirs to. The next space always held what they needed, and the builders wiped away their presence as they left. The unseen services anticipated every need, eliminating the last remnants of human exchange. Eventually, the cafes, restaurants, and shops were replaced by more housing. No one noticed when the final shop closed. The builders had to accommodate everyone, so they kept expanding the city. The algorithms calculated the perfect balance between occupancy and emptiness, ensuring each room spent exactly the right amount of time vacant. Most rooms were empty most of the time, but the algorithms also ensured that every room was visited at the same rate. They demolished the old wonders to house more people, covering the last natural spaces with housing. There was nothing besides the city now. Terminal highway. This is my favorite image. Of course, this is the signature image of this project. The highways crisscross the city, carrying autonomous vehicles on their journeys around the city. The builders put the roads on top, leaving a vast parkland below. The people celebrated this as liberation. Every point was accessible, every location reachable without effort. Without the need for work in the age of perpetual motion, the people could travel from place to place endlessly. The vehicles moved in streams guided by the builders' algorithms, each journey optimized. No collisions, no delays, no uncertainty. Some said the builders had solved movement itself. Others wondered if movement still meant anything at all. When the city was complete, the vehicles ran full of passengers pursuing destinations. Over time, the people got bored of the endless circulation and lost their desire to travel. Many walked, sharing the elevated roads with vehicles that silently adjusted their paths around them. The algorithms noticed no difference between purpose and its absence, maintaining optimal flow whether the vehicles carried passengers or not. In time, most forgot what they had been once trying to reach. People wandered the park while above the vehicles wove between pedestrians with mechanical precision, never touching, never slowing. No one could tell anymore which carried passengers and which were empty. In the perfect system of perpetual motion, such distinctions had ceased to matter. Movement had become ritual rather than necessity. This was one of the only ones that I've actually, if I can get it to move, that I've actually animated using Veo, and you just get a little taste of it. It doesn't really do very much, but you know, at least it's animated. The warehouses of forever. And this almost seems real in California and New Jersey, actually, in these kind of exterior spaces outside the city. I mean, it is real, it's just a little smaller. The builders provided everything for the people. To make it possible to deliver items rapidly, they built massive warehouses in the desert by the city, accompanied by the endless hum of automated trucks and the precise choreography of robotic arms. The builders anticipated every need, delivered every object, fulfilled every request rapidly. The flow of traffic was two-way, with the people storing items they didn't need in the warehouses until they needed them again. The people, no longer tethered to homes or jobs, became transients in their own world. They lived on the move, their numbers dwindled, but warehouses absorbed the absence as easily as they absorbed cargo. For their possible return, the systems worked tirelessly to satisfy any demand. Neighborhoods disappeared beneath the creeping grid, their boundaries erased by the builders' algorithms. The warehouses didn't just devour the city, they became the city. The people who once lived there faded into memory, their spaces absorbed into the vast lattice of logistics. The warehouses archived their civilization piece by piece until nothing remained outside. The walled city. As connectivity grew, every moment of life became a performance, streamed endlessly to the world. Everyone was an influencer, every space optimized for interaction. The builders ensured that no one was ever unseen, the algorithms enforcing perpetual visibility. But one by one, the people had begun to step outside the stream of constant communication. They retreated into their cells and eventually stopped leaving them altogether. At first, the walls were invisible, choices made in silence, a refusal to respond. Within their cells, they rediscovered solitude. Some spent days tracing the shifting patterns of light across the floor. Over time, they built physical walls around their cells, fortifying their homes into sanctuaries of silence, sealed tight against the world. The architects were puzzled. Their systems showed the cells as active, power flowed, resources were consumed, life continued. Yet no data emerged, no contributions were made, no value was generated. The people had discovered that simply existing was enough. In their isolation, the people found peace, but they'd forgotten how to speak. The final fable, the eternal archive. The builders constructed the eternal archive as a grid of squares, each one holding the potential for a life. Some squares contained entrances to underground dwellings. Others remained vacant, waiting. In scattered cells, remnants of the natural world persisted, faint echoes of a nature few still remembered. The eternal archive promised immorality. For those who chose to dwell in a cell, the builders meticulously captured every gesture, thought, and voice, refining a perfect digital projection that could interact across distance and time. The archive preserved every nuance of being. As time passed, no one could tell if they were speaking to living people or flawless simulations of the departed. There actually are services like this. There are. Some questioned whether they'd ever been truly human, while others attempted to disrupt the algorithms with random, unpredictable acts. Yet even rebellion became another learned behavior. By achieving perfect preservation, the archive quietly transformed what it was meant to be human. No one could say who was still real or if anyone was. So my final slide, I just thought I would end with a beginning, not of my beginning, well, all of our beginning. This is Chauvet Pont d'Arc, some 32,000 years old. I was just thinking about this for the last essay I wrote on AIs and on the uncanny. So I'm just going to add by saying, since the dawn of humanity, we've been trying to project our intelligence into the world, take what is inside of us and project it outside, trying to give the world life through art, through buildings, through writing, through music. Often the results are unsettling. Again, I wrote about this at length in the recent essay. This is what fascinates me about our present day, and it suggests that we now have another opportunity to each explore a way to remake the world. We may for the first time be doing it not alone, but with new intelligences. Or it may prove that these things don't do as much as we may assume they will. It may be a second infancy for us. It may be something else entirely. But for me, I would say the only drive is to investigate. And so that's where I'm going now in this journey. Okay, that's the end.